Once we get to bigger projects, it's pretty important to have code that's easy to read and that's also consistent across multiple scripts. So in this video, I want to talk to you about so-called naming conventions, which are basically just standards for naming your variables. So let's jump into Visual Studio. Now, the first and most important rule is to use variable names that speak for themselves. That's really important. Now, I have here two examples. They both do exactly the same thing, but one of those two codes uses variables that speak for themselves. This is this one. So we have HP, we have damage, and then we have a variable called remaining HP, which reduces the HP by the damage. So if I read this, I immediately get what's going on and what is being calculated. Now, this is an example I actually got from a student, and I had to give him a little advice on how to do it better, because you have absolutely no idea what's going on. I mean, who would understand what lol minus ruffle means and what does it do in a variable called Bob? So we have absolutely no idea what this code does. It's just some calculation, but we don't really understand it. So use variable names that you can understand when you read the code, for example, a month or two later. Now, the second rule you need to adhere to is using camel case. Now, that's a funny word, but I'll explain what it means. So these are variables typed in camel case, and this means that the first character is with a small letter, and then every word will be in a capital letter. And that's because you can't have spaces in your variable names. So in order to understand kind of different words, you need to use capital letters. So in this case, we have enemies in range. Okay, that's how we can understand this. And this is the default for all C# programs. So variables will be created starting with a small letter at the beginning, and every further word will have a capital letter. And you may not think these are long variable names. I mean, they aren't too short, that's true, but that's usually not a problem. It's far more important to have your code readable than to have your code as short as possible. Okay, so always use camel case for your variables. There will be other constructs in C# that use different naming convention, but for variables, we use camel case. And the way you can remember to use camel case is just imagine a camel which maybe has its head a little down. So, you know, the first letter is small, and then there's the bump at its back, and that's where the capital letter is. So that's, I mean, at least I think that's the intuition of the persons who invented this, this funny word. All right, so now I have a few more rules that are less important, but just things you should keep in mind. Now, you must start your variable names with a character. So you can't use, for example, 17 to start your variable names, or 1, or I don't know, some random special character. You must use basically something from A to C. There's one exception. You can use the underscore, and that's actually a naming convention some people use, so this is fine, but no other special characters, no numbers. That's it. You need to start with a letter from A to C. One more thing I forgot to mention is that you can actually use numbers in your variables. However, you need to use them in the middle or in the end of the variable name. So I can't use 1 player health, but you can use player 1 health or player health 1 or something like that. That's actually something you will use pretty frequently, especially if you have multiple enemies or players or whatever. Okay, so this works. Now, I also already said there are no blank spaces in C#, at least not for variable names. So you must not use any of those. Also, your variable names should be always in English. No matter what kind of code you write, if you write for a Pakistani, an Indian, a Chinese, English, a German company, always write your code in English. That's basically the default language for programming, and you should use it too. Lastly, don't use any special characters, even if they might work, but don't use like those English accent kind of things. They will just make your life that much harder. So leave these things be. They might still work, but we program in English, so we don't need those anyways. Also, no German umlauts or anything like that. Also, don't use them for your folder names. Visual Studio might crash if you use fancy, strange characters for your folder names where your programs lie, and then you might not be able to compile your programs. So just use plain characters A to C, and you'll be fine. Now, the reason why these rules are so important, imagine you have multiple people working on the same project. You can, of course, imagine that it's pretty important that they have similar rules they adhere to, so the code is, looks similar, no matter who wrote it. So that's basically the whole idea. And no matter how small your project is, even if you're just one person programming on your project, there are still two people who will see your code. Firstly, you, and secondly, God. No, I'm just kidding. He might see it, you never know. But you and the future you. Because when you open your program a month or 2 months later and you don't understand anything because you used funky variable names that are not very intuitive, you're going to have a bad time when you need to adapt your code or update it or debug it or whatever. So adhere to those rules, use camel case, use variable names that speak for themselves, and don't use any fancy, dancy, special characters. Those are the main rules you should adhere to.